There was a woman in Little Italy in the 1920s who ran a kitchen behind a barber shop on Mulberry Street. The barber cut hair in the front. She fed 40 people in the back. You came because someone you trusted told you to come, and what she put on that table could get everyone in the room arrested. One meal on this countdown fed an entire floor of a Chicago tenement from a single iron pot. A sandwich from a back room on Delancey Street got so famous that people lined up in an alley to find it. And a dish from the Filipino quarters of Stockton showed up at card games where the stakes ran higher than the rent. These meals were cooked in basements and back rooms by people who had no permits and no intention of being found. Hit subscribe, because here are 25 speakeasy meals immigrants served behind closed doors. Number 25. Spaghetti aglio e olio. In the back rooms of Mulberry Street during Prohibition, this was the meal that kept the tables full while the wine kept people coming back. Garlic, olive oil, dried chili flakes, and whatever pasta was on hand. Nothing else. The women who ran these kitchens did not need recipes. They needed speed. A pot of water, a handful of garlic sliced thin enough to turn golden in the oil without burning, and 5 minutes of heat. The smell alone told everyone in the building what was happening, which is why most of these kitchens operated in basements where the ventilation pulled the scent down instead of up. The dish showed up on tables in Little Italy, on Bleecker Street, and in the wine cellars of East Harlem where Italian families poured homemade red from unlabeled bottles. Nobody ordered it. Nobody paid for it separately. You sat down, and it appeared. Number 24. Potato knishes. In the back rooms of the Lower East Side, the niche was the meal nobody ordered because it arrived without asking. Street vendors sold them openly on Rivington Street during the day, but after dark, in the social clubs and card rooms along Orchard Street, they showed up wrapped in newspaper alongside glasses of schnapps that no one acknowledged pouring. The filling was plain: mashed potato, fried onion, salt, black pepper, all sealed inside a dough rolled thin enough to crack when you bit through. These were not delicate pastries. They were engineered to hold heat for hours and fill a stomach on the cheap. The men at those tables played cards until dawn, and a fresh tray of knishes appeared on the hour without a word spoken. A niche cost almost nothing to make and fed a man long enough to lose his rent money twice over. Number 23. Stuffed cabbage. In the Hungarian neighborhoods of Cleveland's Buckeye Road, stuffed cabbage showed up at every gathering that happened after the front door was locked. Softened cabbage leaves wrapped around a filling of ground pork, rice, paprika, and onion, then layered into a heavy pot with sauerkraut and simmered until the whole apartment smelled sweet and sour at the same time. The Hungarian social clubs on the East Side kept their own kitchens, and stuffed cabbage was the dish that sat on the counter from the first card game to the last. The women who made it started the night before, blanching the heads of cabbage in salted water and peeling off the leaves one at a time. Every roll was tucked tight, every pot held enough for 40 people, and nobody who walked through those doors left without eating at least 3. Number 22. Dublin coddle. In Hell's Kitchen, the Irish ran blind pigs out of tenement apartments where the front door stayed locked and the back door opened onto a fire escape. The coddle that simmered on the stove in these places was the same one that had simmered in Dublin for generations. Pork sausages, sliced bacon, onions, and potatoes layered in a heavy pot with just enough water to keep everything from sticking. No spices beyond salt and white pepper. The whole thing cooked low and slow until the sausages fell apart and the broth turned thick and cloudy. You could smell it from the hallway. That was the problem. Neighbors who were not invited could follow the smell, and more than one blind pig got shut down because someone followed the scent of coddle up 3 flights of stairs. Number 21. Sauerbraten. Yorkville on the Upper East Side of Manhattan was the center of German immigrant life in New York. And before Prohibition closed the beer halls, Sauerbraten was the meal that anchored every long evening. When the halls shut down, the dish moved into private apartments and social clubs that kept their curtains drawn. Sauerbraten required days of preparation. The beef sat in a bath of vinegar, bay leaves, juniper berries, cloves, and onion, and that long soak broke down even the toughest cuts until the meat fell apart under a fork. The gravy that formed from the braising liquid was ladled over egg noodles or potato dumplings, and it had a tang that no other German dish could match. The families in Yorkville treated it like a weekly ceremony. The vinegar soak went in on Monday, the pot hit the stove on Thursday. By Saturday night, the apartment smelled like a kitchen in Bavaria, and every neighbor on the floor found a reason to knock. Number 20. Bigos. In the Polish neighborhoods of Chicago, there was a stew that could feed a building and survive on the stove for a week. They called it Bigos, the hunter's stew, and in the back rooms behind the butcher shops and social halls of neighborhoods like Pilsen, back of the yards, and Polish Village, it was the centerpiece of every gathering that was never supposed to happen. The base was sauerkraut, cooked down until the sharpness mellowed into something almost sweet. Into that went whatever meat was available. Smoked kielbasa was standard. Pork shoulder, if someone could get a piece from the butcher at a fair price. Dried mushrooms from the old country, or from the Polish grocers who imported them by the barrel. Tomato paste to darken the broth, bay leaves, caraway seeds. The whole thing simmered for hours, and the longer it cooked, the better it tasted. The families who made bigos in these back rooms had an understanding with the neighborhood. The butcher who ran the front of the shop kept his display case clean and legal. What happened in the room behind the freezer was a different arrangement. Men came in through the side door after the shop closed, and by the time the kielbasa hit the pot, there were bottles on the table that had no labels and no receipts. Bigos was the perfect speakeasy meal because it improved with reheating. A pot made on Tuesday was better on Thursday and best on Saturday. It absorbed whatever was added to it. Leftover roast pork went in. A handful of dried prunes went in. A splash of red wine when there was red wine to spare went in. No two pots ever tasted exactly the same. In the Polish neighborhoods of Chicago, Bigos was not a recipe. It was a calendar. You could tell what day of the week it was by how dark the pot had gotten. Number 19. Avgolemono soup. In the Greek neighborhoods of Astoria, Queens, the backroom tavernas served this lemon and egg soup as a first course before the real business of the evening began. The soup itself was simple. Chicken broth thickened with a mixture of beaten eggs and fresh lemon juice, poured in slowly while stirring so the eggs did not scramble. Rice or orzo floated in the broth, and the whole thing had a color somewhere between pale gold and buttermilk, warm, sour, and filling. In Astoria, it showed up on every table whether you asked for it or not. The Greeks called their hidden establishments kafania, and they operated under a simple rule. Coffee and backgammon in the front. Cards, ouzo, and avgolemono in the back. Number 18. The Cuban sandwich. In Ybor City, the cigar-making district of Tampa, Florida, Cuban and Italian immigrants worked side by side in the tobacco factories, and the food that came out of that neighborhood reflected both traditions. The Cuban sandwich was built on Cuban bread, pressed flat on a hot iron, and filled with roast pork, ham, Swiss cheese, pickles, and yellow mustard. The bread was the key, a thin, shattering crust and a soft interior that compressed under the iron without turning tough. In the bolita parlors of Ybor City, where men played an illegal numbers game that was the neighborhood's unofficial lottery, the Cuban sandwich was what you ate while you waited for the draw. The sandwich came cut on a diagonal and served alongside black coffee sweetened with so much sugar it was almost syrup. Nobody called these parlors speakeasies, but the function was the same. A closed door, an illegal activity, and a meal that made the waiting easier. Number 17. Chicken cacciatore. The wine cellars of Italian Harlem were not wine cellars in any legal sense after 1920. They were rooms below street level where families stored the barrels of wine they made every autumn from grapes shipped up by rail from California. The wine was illegal. The chicken cacciatore that accompanied it was not, but the two were inseparable. A whole chicken, cut into pieces, browned in olive oil, then braised in a sauce of crushed tomatoes, bell peppers, onions, garlic, and whatever wine was too rough to drink on its own. The peppers softened into the sauce until they dissolved, and the chicken fell off the bone after an hour of slow cooking. The cacciatore served in these cellars had a deeper flavor than the restaurant version upstairs because the home cooks used their own wine in the sauce and their own canned tomatoes from the summer harvest. Every ingredient had a name behind it. The tomatoes came from a rooftop garden. The wine came from a cousin who shipped the grapes. There is something worth noting about every meal on this list so far. None of them were invented for the speakeasy. Every single one came from somewhere else. A village, a country, a grandmother's kitchen, an ocean away. What Prohibition did was push them underground, and something changed when a meal that was meant to be shared openly had to be shared in secret. The portions got bigger, the flavors got stronger, the cooking got more deliberate. When the door is locked, you cook like it matters more. Number 16. Smoked brisket. In the social clubs of Brownsville, Brooklyn, Jewish immigrants served brisket that had been smoked low and slow over hardwood until the fat cap rendered down into the meat. These were not the famous delicatessens of Manhattan. These were smaller, quieter rooms above dry goods stores and behind synagogues where men gathered to argue politics, play pinochle, and drink rye whiskey that arrived in unmarked bottles. The brisket came out sliced thick, laid across rye bread, and served with a sharp brown mustard that cleared the sinuses. The smoking was done in makeshift smokers built from old metal drums in backyards and on rooftops, and the entire block knew when brisket day was because the smoke drifted across the clotheslines. The women who prepared these meals rarely came to the social clubs themselves. They sent the food over with their sons, and the sons came back with empty trays. Number 15. Chow mein. In the after-hours clubs of Chinatown, chow mein was the meal that arrived at 2 a.m. when the gambling tables were still full and the kitchen was running on whatever the cooks had left. Wheat noodles fried crisp in a wok, then topped with shredded cabbage, pork, and a ladle of oyster sauce thinned with stock. The noodles crackled when the sauce hit them. The dish took less than 10 minutes to make, which was the point. Speed mattered in a kitchen that was feeding people who did not want to stop what they were doing long enough to eat a proper meal. Chow mein was designed to be eaten with one hand. The other hand stayed on the table. Number 14. Pernil asado. In the basement apartments of East Harlem, which the Puerto Rican community called El Barrio, the pernil was the meal that turned a gathering into an event. A whole pork shoulder, rubbed with garlic, oregano, cumin, vinegar, and black pepper, then roasted slowly in the oven for hours until the skin crackled and the meat underneath turned so tender it shredded at the touch of a fork. These were not dinner parties with invitations. These were basement gatherings where someone pushed the furniture against the walls, set up a folding table, and waited for the building to show up. The door to the basement stayed closed from the outside, and everyone who came in knew to use the side entrance by the boiler room. There was almost always music, a radio playing boleros, or someone with a guitar, or later a record player spinning salsa. And in the middle of all of it sat the pernil, carved directly off the bone onto plates that people held in their laps because there were never enough chairs. The skin was the prize, crispy, salty, shatteringly brittle, pulled off in pieces and eaten with the fingers before anything else was touched. Rice and beans came alongside, and someone always brought a pot of sofrito to pour over everything. What made the pernil a speakeasy meal was the economics. A whole pork shoulder was cheap, and it fed 20 or 30 people without anyone having to cook more than one dish. The host provided the pork. The neighbors brought the sides. The rum came from somewhere nobody discussed in detail. The landlords above rarely came down. The police rarely came in. And the pernil cooked in that oven all day, filling the building with a smell that everyone recognized and nobody reported. Number 13. Bratwurst and sauerkraut. In Milwaukee, the German social clubs known as Turnvereins had operated as gymnasiums and gathering halls since the middle of the 1800s, and when Prohibition arrived, the beer that had always flowed at these clubs simply moved out of sight. The bratwurst, served in the back rooms of these halls, was grilled over charcoal and placed on a thick slice of dark bread with a heap of sauerkraut that had been cooked with caraway seeds and a splash of whatever lager was available. No bun, no condiments beyond mustard. The combination was salty, sour, and heavy, and it was designed to be eaten alongside steins of beer that the club swore it did not serve. Milwaukee never took prohibition seriously, and the Turnverens barely pretended. Number 12. Halušky. In the Slovak and Polish neighborhoods of Pittsburgh's South Side, Halušky was the dish that fueled the after-shift gatherings where steelworkers drank what they were not supposed to have. Egg noodles fried in butter with shredded cabbage, onion, salt, and black pepper. That was it. Nothing expensive, nothing imported, and nothing that required more than one pan and 15 minutes of standing at the stove. The social halls along Carson Street served it by the plateful, and the men who came straight from the mill ate it with their hands still black from the furnace. Halušky stuck to your ribs the way a meal was supposed to. It soaked up the whiskey. It kept you warm through a conversation that lasted past midnight. And when the pot was empty, somebody's wife sent another one down the stairs without being asked. Number 11. Kibbeh. On Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, the Lebanese and Syrian immigrants who settled there in the early 1900s built a food culture that most of New York never saw. Kibbeh was the signature. A shell of bulgur wheat mixed with ground lamb and spices, shaped into a torpedo, stuffed with a filling of more lamb cooked with pine nuts, onions, and cinnamon, then deep-fried until the outside turned dark and crisp. The kibbeh served in the private clubs of Atlantic Avenue came out on platters alongside bowls of labneh, pickled turnips, and flatbread torn into pieces. The clubs were modeled on the coffeehouses of Beirut and Damascus, and they operated quietly above the storefronts that sold spices and imported olives. Arak, the anise-flavored spirit of the Eastern Mediterranean, flowed in these rooms long before and long after Prohibition. The community was small enough that outsiders were noticed immediately, and the door stayed open only for people who belonged. Kibbeh was what they ate while they argued about politics back home, and the arguments lasted longer than the platters. Number 10. Pierogi. In Chicago's Polish Triangle, the pierogi was the universal currency of every gathering that happened after dark. Dumplings filled with potato and farmer's cheese or with sauerkraut and mushroom, boiled until they floated, then fried in butter until the edges browned and blistered. The women who made them worked in assembly lines at kitchen tables, one rolling the dough, one cutting the circles, one filling and pinching them shut. A single evening's production could fill a bushel basket, and the pierogi went straight from the kitchen to whatever back room or church basement was hosting that night's gathering. They arrived hot, glistening with butter and dusted with fried onions. Everyone ate them by hand, 2 at a time, standing around tables covered with newspaper. Every immigrant neighborhood in America had a version of the same arrangement. A legitimate business in the front, a room in the back or below that operated by different rules. The food in that second room was never meant to impress anyone. It was meant to anchor an evening, to give people a reason to sit down and stay, and to turn a room full of workers who shared a language into something that felt like a village. The meal was the architecture. The drink was just the door. Number 9. Pastrami on rye. On the Lower East Side, there were delicatessens that operated 2 businesses at once. In the front, the counter served sandwiches to anyone who walked in off the street. In the back, through a curtain or a narrow hallway, there was a room with tables, low lighting, and bottles of rye whiskey that appeared and disappeared depending on who was watching. The pastrami that came out of these back rooms was the same pastrami sold up front, but the experience was different. You sat down. You stayed. The sandwich arrived on rye bread that was fresh that morning, sliced thick, with a smear of spicy brown mustard and nothing else. No lettuce, no tomato, just the meat, the bread, and the mustard, and a glass of whiskey that nobody put on any receipt. The pastrami itself was made from the navel cut of beef, cured in a brine of salt, sugar, garlic, and pickling spices for days, then coated in a crust of cracked black pepper and coriander and smoked over hardwood until the fat turned translucent and the meat turned a deep reddish color at the edges. Slicing it was an art. Too thick and it was chewy. Too thin and it fell apart. The men who ran these delis had been slicing pastrami since they arrived from Romania or Hungary, and they could cut it to the right thickness without looking. What made the back room different from the front counter was time. Up front, you ate and left. In the back, you sat for hours. The pastrami was the same. The rye was the same. But behind the curtain, you were not a customer. You were a guest, and guests got refills on the whiskey and second helpings on the bread. The delis on Delancey Street and Houston Street that ran these rooms never advertised them. The line in the alley on a Saturday night told you everything you needed to know. Number 8. Spanakopita. In Tarpon Springs, Florida, the Greek sponge divers who settled there in the early 1900s brought their food with them, and spanakopita was the dish that showed up at every private gathering. Layers of phyllo dough brushed with olive oil, filled with a mixture of spinach, feta cheese, onions, dill, and eggs, then baked until the top turned golden and flaky. The women of Tarpon Springs made spanakopita in large rectangular pans that fed a dozen people at a time, and the pans traveled from house to house wrapped in towels to hold the heat. The sponge divers drank ouzo in their homes after the boats came in, and the spanakopita was already on the table when they walked through the door. Number 7. Black beans and rice. In Key West and later in Tampa, Cuban immigrants built a food culture around black beans slow-cooked with garlic, cumin, oregano, and bay leaves, ladled over white rice with a splash of vinegar and a drizzle of olive oil on top. In the casas de juego, the gambling houses that operated in the back rooms of cigar shops and private homes, black beans and rice never stopped being available. The pot sat on the stove all day. Someone ladled out a plate whenever a new player sat down. The beans thickened as the hours passed, and by midnight the consistency had shifted from soup to something closer to a paste that clung to the rice and held the vinegar like a sponge. Nobody measured anything. The garlic went in whole and crushed with the flat of a knife. The cumin came from a jar with no label. The meal fed whoever showed up, for as long as they stayed. Number 6. Pasticcio. In the Greek coffeehouses of Chicago's Greektown along Halsted Street, pasticcio was the dish that turned a card game into a dinner party. Tubular pasta layered with spiced ground lamb, tomato, cinnamon, and a thick bechamel poured over the top, then baked until the surface cracked golden brown. The coffeehouses operated as social clubs where men played tavli and drank coffee that could strip paint. But after hours, the back tables cleared for food and bottles of ouzo that appeared from behind the counter. Pasticcio was ideal for these gatherings because it could sit in a baking pan for hours and still taste right. It was cut into squares and served on small plates, and the cinnamon in the meat made the whole room smell like something between a bakery and a butcher shop. The women who made it rarely came to the coffee house. They sent it with their husbands and never saw the pan again until morning. Number 5. Bánh Cuon. In the back rooms of Vietnamese grocery stores along Bolsa Avenue in Westminster, California, women set up folding tables and portable steamers and served bánh cuon to anyone who knew to ask. These were not listed on any menu. You walked past the shelves of fish sauce and dried shrimp, through a curtain, and sat down. The rice batter was ladled onto a cloth stretched over a pot of boiling water, and within seconds it set into a translucent sheet so thin you could almost see through it. The filling was ground pork and wood ear mushrooms, seasoned with shallots and black pepper, spooned onto the center and rolled loosely. It came to the table still warm, sliced into segments, with a bowl of nuoc cham on the side and a plate of chalua, the pale, smooth pork sausage that no one outside the community had ever heard of. The women who made these had been doing it since before they crossed the Pacific. In Saigon, bánh cuon was street food. In Orange County in the early 1980s, it was something you only found if someone told you where to look. The steam filled the back room, and the smell of pork and mushrooms settled into the walls. Regulars brought their own chopsticks. Number 4. Jerk chicken. In the basements and backyards of Flatbush, Brooklyn, Jamaican families slow-cooked jerk chicken over makeshift drum grills, fashioned from oil barrels cut in half. The smoke was the problem. It drifted up through the windows and over the fences, and neighbors who did not understand what was happening called in complaints. So the cooking moved further inside, into garages with the door cracked open just enough to let the smoke out, or into kitchens where the oven stood in for the grill and the seasoning did most of the work. The marinade was Scotch bonnet peppers, allspice, thyme, scallions, garlic, and ginger, ground together and rubbed deep into chicken legs and thighs that sat overnight in the mixture. The heat from the Scotch bonnets was not decorative. It went through the meat and stayed there. At weekend gatherings in rented halls and church basements along Nostrand Avenue, the jerk chicken arrived wrapped in foil, still hot, and was eaten with hard dough bread and a ginger beer so strong it burned on the way down. These were not advertised. You heard about them at the barbershop or from a cousin. The chicken was the reason people came, and the empty foil trays were the reason the next gathering got planned. Number 3. Meatballs in red sauce. On Arthur Avenue in the Bronx, the Italian families who turned their apartments into informal restaurants during Prohibition served meatballs that weighed more than a fist and sat in a sauce that had been cooking since morning. A mixture of ground beef, ground pork, stale bread soaked in milk, eggs, garlic, parsley, and grated cheese, rolled by hand and browned in olive oil before going into the pot. The sauce was tomatoes crushed by hand, cooked with garlic and basil until the oil floated to the surface and the color deepened from red to something closer to rust. These apartments charged nothing for the food. The food was a gift. The wine that accompanied it was the product being sold, though nobody used that word. A family on Arthur Avenue could feed 30 people on a Saturday night with one pot of meatballs, one pot of pasta, and enough homemade wine to keep everyone in the room past midnight. Number 2. Noodle Kugel. In the tenement kitchens of the Lower East Side, Kugel was the dish that Jewish grandmothers made when they wanted to stretch a handful of ingredients into something that could feed a table full of people who had not been expected. Egg noodles baked in a mixture of eggs, sour cream, cottage cheese, sugar, cinnamon, and raisins until the top turned brown and the edges crisped. The kugel came out of the oven in the same pan it was baked in, and it was served at room temperature, which made it ideal for gatherings that started in the evening and ran deep into the night. In the living rooms that doubled as card rooms and the parlors that doubled as meeting halls, kugel sat on a side table alongside sponge cake and a bottle of sweet wine or brandy. Nobody kept track of who ate how much. The pan was refilled when it emptied, and it always emptied. Number 1. Sunday gravy. Not marinara, not bolognese. Sunday gravy, the sugo della domenica, the sauce that took all day and used every cut of cheap meat the butcher had left. Braciole, pork ribs, sausage links, sometimes a piece of beef neck or oxtail, all browned and then buried in a tomato sauce that simmered from early morning until the family sat down in the late afternoon. In the Italian neighborhoods of New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago, Sunday gravy was the meal that every locked door existed to protect. It was not speakeasy food in the strictest sense. It was the food that made the speakeasy possible, because a room where Sunday gravy was cooking was a room where people stayed for hours, and hours meant drinks, and drinks meant money that changed hands quietly. The door stayed closed, the sauce stayed on, and if you grew up anywhere near one of those kitchens, you already know that the smell reached the sidewalk before the first glass was poured. Every other meal on this list filled a stomach. This one built a neighborhood. Those 25 meals were never written down in any recipe book. They were passed hand to hand, stove to stove, across neighborhoods that do not look the same anymore. The doors are gone, the back rooms are gone, but the recipes survived because the people who cooked them never needed a door to begin with. They just needed a stove.